Hey there, everybody. Hope things are going good these days as we get further through our course, a little further into October, getting close to Halloween. And so we have just finished up the midterm that gave us kind of a pause to look backwards a little bit at some of the terrain we covered. We've moved into the Victorian period. It happens to be the Thursday, October 18th today, which is when the Matthew Arnold unit is due, and then we move into the Brownings, which is a study of one of the most famous literary couples in the Western tradition, Elizabeth Barrett Browning and Robert Browning. And in fact, one of those interesting cases where, I guess it's debatable, of course, but the female part of the partnership is arguably the more famous, which is unusual for us, not because the female authors were generally not successful or not as sophisticated writers as their male counterparts, but obviously history for the longest time just valued the male authorship much more than female. But we have a nice inversion of that, although they're both fascinating to read and in fact share some fundamental things in common in terms of their principles and their social ideas maybe, but their work is very different. So kind of a study in contrast makes it interesting. So Unit 9 itself, and I had mentioned this previously in terms of getting into the Victorian period, which, and as literary periods go, it's almost the pendulum sort of swings one way and then the other and back again. So we have this Enlightenment focus on reason as the fundamental ability that we have to solve social problems, to better ourselves in the world, to better the world we're in. And then kind of a growing mistrust of that as we move into the Romantic period, which was a period of optimism, but a lot of that hope was pinned on the possibilities of the imagination to see a different world. So kind of getting away from reason, as those two things are not opposite, obviously, but they do kind of exist on a continuum in some ways. And the Victorian period really sees a movement back, big surprise, to an insistence on reason. And so Matthew Arnold is a figure who in many ways is a lot like Milton. He picks up that strain of people's free will, but conditioned by the application of reason. So one of the things that you'll see Matthew Arnold argue, which is a very contemporary idea to me, is that people have free will and freedom. They have personal liberty. But the idea that that means that you can just do whatever you want or do as one likes is what Arnold says is crazy, right? It doesn't make any sense. So yes, we have personal liberty and that should be protected, but it's only to be exercised or used within I don't want to say the confines, but within the sort of boundaries set up by reasonable behavior, which sounds pretty reasonable in and of itself, doesn't it? But flip through your TV channels midday when those courtroom drama things are on, and man, oh man, personal liberty and reason are like on totally different planets, So anyway, Arnold's theory, which sounds so commonsensical to me, doesn't seem to have played out. But it's still worth, I think, fighting for or thinking about or insisting on the application of reason to limit or to guide the idea of personal liberty. So anyway, the insistence on reason, of course, takes us back to people like Wollstonecraft and Milton before her. He's also an interesting figure because he was both a poet and more of a theorist, a social theorist. So part of what we're reading is his poetic work, but also his ideas about, again, the application of reason and sort of culture as it existed in the Victorian period. And he expresses that fundamental fear of the Victorian period, that there's no one single change that is overwhelming people, but it's simply the pace of change itself. And how does one exist? How does the self exist in this ever-changing kind of environment? And part of his answer, of course, is reason, but also education, right? And the sort of idea of sweetness and light, which is a kind of a corny phrase, but if you give it time, it'll grow on you, I promise. This notion that through the study of the best that hath been thought and said in the world, Arnold was full of these great quotes, through the study of that we could improve our intellect and our sort of emotional intelligence and all that stuff, and ultimately our reason, and thus we could have personal liberty, but we wouldn't have, nut jobs doing whatever they want in the spirit of, I can do whatever I want, therefore I'm going to do whatever I want. The problem with the theory of that, the study of the best that hath been thought and said in the world, is who gets to decide, right? Who gets to be taught in the classroom as the best? And while we could agree maybe on a couple of things, part of the problem of the history of education is that so many voices have been excluded from that category of best, that it became sort of this just repeating cycle of study of the same dead white male authors, some of whom are great and I love, but you obviously need a canon or a group of writers to study that's more diverse than that, otherwise you really get stuck. So that, I think, is the problem with this theory of education that Arnold put forth. But again, even though his theories have these sort of trouble spots or sticking points, I don't think that devalues them entirely. And Arnold himself is a really fascinating guy, but also a fascinating author writing in a period that itself is so awash in change that it's he represents this kind of accessible voice for us during that time period. And he had the best like mutton chop thing, sideburns, whatever, going on. Very Victorian looking. So we move then away from Arnold into the Brownings unit. And Arnold was obviously deeply concerned with kind of social issues, right? But he was, in some ways, a conservative voice. And I hate to use that term because it's so loaded with contemporary baggage. So maybe just think of conservative as not social conservative or like conservative on issues, but in its truest sense of one who looked to the past for models that we could follow going into the future. The Brownings are a lot different from that, at least in as much as they're, and again, Elizabeth Barrett Browning becomes the model for this, as a really socially progressive voice. And I don't mean to kind of oppose Arnold and Browning in that way, because it didn't really work like that. But you'll notice a very different tenor in their writing. And of course, Robert Browning, at least the piece that we're reading, it sounds like it's sort of completely off the charts as far as social issues go. But both the Brownings are deeply concerned with child labor, which will be explicitly explored in Elizabeth Barrett Browning's poem, Cry of the Children. But I think even issues of sort of gender and gender justice are explored by Robert Browning, though kind of elliptically or by allusion, in the dramatic monologue that we read, My Last Duchess. And My Last Duchess is just a great poem. It's fun to read because it features this really evil, devious character. But the technique of dramatic monologue is really fascinating because you have a single speaker for the most part. So it's monologic. It just goes to you. And it's almost like we then become the hearer, the other character in the poem. But what authors can do by using dramatic monologue is introduce another term or another device called dramatic irony. In other words, the difference between what a character seems to know or want to express to us, in other words, the words that they say, and then versus the gap between that and what we actually learn about the character by virtue of what they say or the actions that they take. So we sort of make character judgments less on the words coming out of their mouth or what they intend than the connotations that everything they say suggests. So you'll see that the Duke or Browning's handling of voice in that poem is really deft. The Duke never comes out and says explicitly really anything that is outright barbarous, but clearly he's a pretty barbarous guy. So, and the degree to which he's a rhetorical strategist, the Duke is, he uses speech to his advantage. He claims that he's not a good speaker, but in fact that's a technique used by the most sophisticated speakers. So he was, of course, a politician in the fiction of the poem, but he would have been would be a great politician these days because they all engage in these kinds of rhetorical strategies. Okay, anyway, that's a lot to take in. So, as always, be in touch with any questions or concerns. I've really enjoyed reading the work that people are doing, so keep up the good work, and we are about midway through, a little bit more, and the individual days can go quite slowly sometimes, but the term itself goes very fast. So half of it's done, and we have just half of it left. Throw in there Thanksgiving and the sort of wind down that always happens towards the end of the term, and we are getting fairly close to the end of our course, so hang in there. I'll talk to you soon.